Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at Future of Good's first Changemaker Wellbeing Summit. We hope you've had a wonderful couple of days so far. There's been so much covered, and we hope you've been able to reflect on some of the takeaways with your teams as well. We're now moving into our concurrent panels for the second day. So we actually have 3 events running simultaneously at the moment about leadership wellbeing, about trust-based funding models, and this one, which is about innovations in workplace benefits. My name is Charlene Gandhi. I am the tech and data reporter here at Future of Good. And I'm joining you all today from Toronto, which is the home of many diverse First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, and is a traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples. We have panelists joining from this land and from Treaty 6 territory in what is colonially known as Edmonton. Over the next few hours that are left of this wonderful summit, I'd love for us to just take a little bit of time to ground ourselves in land and in physical space that we're in, and to show gratitude for the nature that sustains us. So in this session, we are going to be talking about all things innovation in workplace benefits. They've evolved hugely over the last couple of years. And actually, as we were prepping for this panel a couple of days ago, one of our panelists, Bruce McDonald, pointed out that we actually need to situate ourselves in a discussion that organizations come from various different places when it comes to the benefits that they offer their employees. And so this isn't a discussion about medical, dental, or pension-related benefits, but rather one about pushing the discussion and the boundaries of what encompasses human resources in a way that makes your organization and the sector more widely an appealing and a competitive place to work. Today, we have organizations trialing 4-day work weeks, 9-day fortnights, shorter work days, and all manner of new ways and times of working. We have organizations offering dedicated pots of funding for professional development to help employees with their work from home spaces, and extended childcare and pet care benefits. Now, those looking for jobs and those already in jobs are making decisions about their employment, even based with these employment packages in mind. They're also making decisions based on what an employer chooses not to share. Now, for example, discussions about salary transparency have hinged on that. So for employers and leaders in the nonprofit sector, that really means keeping up to date with the latest innovations and trials in well-being, such that the sector remains an attractive place to work. We are going to be focusing this discussion on paid staff rather than volunteers, although of course both are equally important to a thriving nonprofit sector. Simultaneously, we'll also grapple with the reality that a lot of organizations in the sector don't necessarily have a dedicated staff member or a team working on these human resources issues. And in the case that it's a time-strapped ED handling these questions about culture building and workplace benefits, where does an organization begin? Without further ado, I am going to introduce our wonderful panelists who'll be doing the bulk of the talking today. We have Omar Yaqub from Islamic Family, we have Bruce McDonald from Imagine Canada, Amanda Richardson from LVR Wellbeing, and Olga Morochinsky from Heal 3. I am going to start by quickly asking you all to introduce yourselves and your organizations, and just to ask one question to begin, and that is, where you've seen an example of an innovative workplace well-being benefit that you think really shifts the dial when it comes to these benefits. Bruce, perhaps we will start with you.
Great, thanks so much, Charlene, and looking forward to the discussion, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So Bruce McDonald, I'm the president and CEO at Imagine Canada. Often thought of as an Ontario-based organization, but now with staff almost right across the country, but getting there. In terms of this question around kind of a particular idea or innovation, I mean, you mentioned it in your opening remarks. I'm going to focus a little bit on the 4-day work week. This is something that Imagine Canada started in piloting in early 2023. 6 months into the year, we decided to extend it through to the end of 2023, pending an evaluation. We needed more data. And based on the results of that, we've now made the decision to continue it right through to the end of 2024. And I think, as I have been thinking about this discussion around, sort of workplace practices and well-being, for us, there was really a couple of intentional objectives. One was we needed to think about how fundamental questions around work, happiness, and the health of our employees, And from a business perspective, in a CEO role, how are we going to offer an attractive package for those who are seeking employment, and how are we going to retain the staff that we had? So we started this practice, and I just maybe share a couple of data points with you in terms of how it's been going. We created a 48 metric scorecard to try and understand, both from an employee well-being perspective and a work performance perspective, how we were doing. On the employee side, really, as we had hoped, the happiness indicators are significantly higher than they had been before we started that. Sick time was down 40%, 40% year over year comparison. And when we did the evaluation in the early fall last year, we had 100% retention rate of staff since announcing our desire or our plan to do a 4-day work week. So there were really some strong indicators, I would say, on the performance one, because people say, well, okay, well, yeah, everybody's going to be happier in this, or hopefully they will, but how's the work doing? What we found was that our work was on par, ahead, and sometimes behind. But when we dug into where we were behind, we didn't attribute it to the 4-day work week. There were other factors involved there. So for us, it really has forced us to ask fundamental questions about the way we work and make changes. And what's also been wonderful, and I'll wrap this up, is hearing the stories of what people are doing on the 5th day. Some are re-engaging with their faith. Others are going back to school. Some are doing errands so they can spend quality time with their kids on the weekend. But what we're seeing is an energized work environment when they're there those 4 days. So thanks.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for opening with that, Bruce. I think there's a lot of points about how we go about measuring a lot of these benefits as well that we'll move on to later on in the discussion. Olga, perhaps we'll move on to you next.
Yes, thank you. My name is Olga. I'm the co-founder and head of wellbeing programs at an organization called Heal3. And what we do is we develop tailored wellbeing programs for small and medium enterprises. But we also are launching Canada's first holistic benefit this year, which covers over 60 modalities and includes over 200 holistic practitioners. And I will actually kind of point to that as a potential innovation, and because I'll give you kind of the background as to why we did this in the first place. I'd been in the insurance and benefits space for many years, and one thing that always frustrated me is that people themselves couldn't choose within their benefits package how they could feel better, right? So we have a list of prescribed paramedicals, we've got a list of chosen mental health specialists that are covered, but meanwhile, we all have different ways of kind of not only taking care of ourselves, preventing ourselves from getting sick. I cold plunge 3 times a week. I see an energy healer. I do lots and lots of different things. And I wanted to know, why is it that couldn't be covered under a traditional benefits plan? So we kind of really went out and kind of thought about how we could do this. And when we kind of got into and started to see how it is that people are using these types of accounts, I mean, it was incredible. I mean, we were seeing usage of Indigenous healers and Chinese medicine practitioners and just lots of things, even people that weren't necessarily certified or credentialed in the way that insurance companies want them. But the fundamental kind of important thing was that it made people feel better and it helped them to show up for work, which I think is so important, and what employers like Bruce definitely kind of want, because that helps engagement. But because Bruce had so much good data, I'll give you kind of one data point, which is, I think, important here. These types of accounts they're called flexible spending accounts. They give kind of the opportunity, for people to choose. When it comes to cost, they can be 40 to 60% cheaper, less expensive is probably the better word than traditional benefits, right? So you can actually still have a great package to support attraction and retention, but do it at a way where you as an organization can control those costs. So I think we can have it all as in the nonprofit space. So thank you, and it's nice to be here.
Fantastic, amazing, lots and lots to touch on there, but I love the idea of a cold plunge as a workplace benefit. Amazing. Omar, we're going to move on to you next.
Yeah, thank you, Shrew. My name is Omar. I get to serve the team at Islamic Family. We're an Imagine Canada accredited charity, which I'm really, really proud of. We're also Great Places to Work certified, which is not something common in the nonprofit sector. We're a frontline social service agency, and so many of the things that other people have talked about, the struggles of being an ED and having to support maybe HR crises from the side of your desk is something I can really relate to. In addition to what we've talked about in terms of benefits, I think it's also really important to think about how do we structure the work and what are the tools we put in place for our teams. Oftentimes we take it as a given that the tools people use should be really frustrating, that we should accept systemic inequity. And I think part of what we can be doing in our roles is actually designing different tools. One of the things we've done in our organization is actually redesign the welcoming process. So try and make it less clinical, less interrogative, changing it from an intake to something where we're spending more time trying to get to know the person and setting our frontline workers up to do the best work they can to really unlock their frontline superpowers.
Phenomenal. I really like that great place to work certification. I'm sure we'll dig a little bit more into that going forwards. Amanda, last but not least, love to hear from you.
Yeah, thanks so much. For the opportunity to join the conversation. I'm Amanda Richardson with the team at Level Wellbeing. I'm the member success lead. I work cross-functionally across our commercial, our member success, client success, product teams. I'm dialing in from Woodstock, Ontario. But in terms of, and I love all of these innovative benefits, that is definitely, the wheelhouse of what Level is. But to kind of add on to, I love my 4.5-day work week, and that well-being benefit that was mentioned around being able that cash spending, right? Where what works for me is what I get to add to my benefit. But we also uniquely have this opportunity to actually double our well-being benefit. So if we as a team achieve, so individually, I should say, achieve 85% sleep, across a month, we can actually double our well-being benefit. So our team is actually paying us to sleep essentially. So we're really prioritizing like that element of, so just to kind of dial in on like different ways of, supporting and empowering people to really drive, maximize their benefit. So that's
Amazing. Thank you so much. And that's kind of really reminded me of a book that I read recently called Rest is Resistance. And I'd recommend it to anybody watching this particular webinar or just attending the summit overall, and just how productive rest is, but how much we've kind of sidelined it and ignored it over the years. Amazing. So we've started by talking a little bit about some of the great innovations that you all have in your own workplaces. Something that we spoke about a few days ago, and something that I've personally noticed, is that we seem as a kind of overall work culture to be shifting back to this 5-day in the office micromanagement mentality. And what I wanted to pose to you guys as a first question is, in that context, what sorts of benefits and ways of working do you feel just aren't working anymore and feel outdated? Olga, perhaps we'll start with you on this one.
Sure. Well, I am going to kind of point to some of the, again, going back to traditional benefits, because I think the transition to work, and I know this has been discussed over the past few days, is back to work has not been an easy one for most people. And even if they're not going back to work, the transition to hybrid work or remote work, I mean, that's all been difficult. And when I look at mental health benefits and how most companies set them up today, I mean, I don't think they support kind of what it is that people need, right? In most cases, we get $500 per year, which probably covers 1 or 2 sessions, right? Again, the modalities are so limited. Maybe some drugs are covered as well. But, we did a big study on this last year. And what we learned from mental health experts is that 30 to 50% are treatment resistant to kind of these modalities. So they don't help anyways, even if they are covered. So I do think we need to look for more ways, and not just through benefits, but through workplace programs, through engagement and connection in the workplace, to really help us support that transition and help people navigate the continuous changes that they're being faced with in this new world of work.
How does that resonate with the rest of you, if you want to jump in? Omar, I'll pick on you.
I can jump in. One thing I just want to add to what Olga was saying is the existing way benefits work is a bit of a trap, right? You'll sign up year one and you have a plan that maybe works for 3/4 of your employees. Year 2, year 3, it's time for renewal, and now you're faced with a predicament. Your benefits per employee go down, or you're covering less people, or your rates go up. And so you're in a spiral where the quality of what you get is going down and the cost is going up simultaneously. Many people still have an assumption that benefits plans really work for them, that they're paying X dollars in and getting X plus dollars out. But the reality for many people is that they're actually getting less and less out of benefits compared to what they were getting only a few years ago. One thing I want to add to the conversation is when we talk about what's not working in the workplace, I think sometimes there's an overemphasis on self-care. Now, I don't want to undermine self-care in any way, but self-care is sometimes used as a way of saying, oh, that's your responsibility. It's like telling the person with a broken arm to mend it themselves. I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is how do we move from self-care to collective care in our work? And collective care is looking at how do we design workplaces to be supportive of people, to be empathic, to think about different modalities for people to find care while they're doing work. So one of the things we do in our workspaces, we have a punching bag where people can, if they need to, just punch something. We have space for chat. We have space for art, space for prayer. And those are ways that people can find different modalities for healing within their day-to-day work.
I feel like I need to see some data on usage of said punching bag. I love that. Or of the art space, one of the two. Amanda, Bruce, either of you want to chime in there as well?
Yeah. I would say kind of in terms of like what's not working, is just kind of that gap in, overall leadership in like outdated ways. I think part of this in like developing a well-being strategy, whether you have one or, an existing one. And if you don't have one, if you're trying to develop one, that we have to recognize that a strategy is much like a well-being journey. So, it's not going to be a linear growth. You have to revisit and you're going to have to succeed and fail at things in the process of building that strategy. And I think that, that outdated when it comes to, there's a gap in leadership and the way we think around, the tick box of well-being, right? That, this is a collective effort. So we definitely need leadership on the forefront, but rooting that well-being has to be done like in psychological safety of, building that for the organization first and foremost. I think that's where we have to dive into first and foremost.
And maybe just sort of picking up on this theme, I might frame it slightly differently. I think what no longer works is workplaces without trust. So in a way that the only way you determine worth or value of how employees are working is that you witness them and you watch them in remote or fully distributed environments, that no longer works. And so how are we as leaders and organizations creating work environments that foster trust and have accountability? I don't think there's anything wrong with being accountable. We're accountable to our donors, our boards, our supervisors, our members, our missions and causes. But constructed together, it's mutual accountability. And I think for those who are going to be working in different environments, ensuring that the mindset, the starting place is this idea that we're not going to see you every day. We're not going to see you any days. But we actually trust that we've hired the right people. We've put the right principles in place, done good onboarding, are doing everything we possibly can. And that we're also going to collectively understand if we're making a difference.
Amazing. There's a lot of really great things that have come out of that I think are going to be real jumping off points for the next portion of the discussion. But I think what we've really seen there is that question of how do you balance accountability with trust, with collective care, with that psychological safety, Amanda, that you brought up as well. And in finding that balance and in kind of trying to find that sweet spot, what is working? What is working when you've got teams that are hybrid, that are completely distributed? What's going well? Bruce, we're going to give you an opportunity to talk about that 4-day work week because there's been a question about how that's working in practice. So perhaps we can start there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of just the starting principle as we embarked on this is that it's 100% of the pay for 80% of the time with a commitment to deliver 100% or more of the impact. And so we're not seeking to jam 5 days of work hours into 4 days. It's 4 days of what were regular work hours. Um, the interesting part has been, as someone who's been around the block a long time, what I really noticed was that fundamental changes in the way we work were being driven at all levels of our organization. So people asking questions, does that meeting need to be 90 minutes? Can we do it in 30 or 45? Do we need to do it every week? Can we do more work offline or in an asynchronous way? So fundamental changes to practice have changed. The other part I would note is that what has worked well for the 4-day work week is that we had an environment of a fairly formal operating plan. We use an objectives and key results format. It starts with our strategic plan. We have a theory of change. That is the construct of our annual operating plan of objectives and key results. And every employee has their own objectives and key results. Not being able to talk about the performance side was viewed as a significant weakness in terms of embarking on the conversation. But we were fortunate; we were already there. So that was just a little bit on the 4-day work week. The other one point I did want to just sort of make on this kind of overall question around what's working in a hybrid, or in Imagine Canada's case, we're fully distributed. For us, if there's been a silver lining in the pandemic cloud, it has been this formal change to a complete work from home option. We're a national organization, and I would say there has been a view that we have been a Central Canada or Ontario focused organization, in part because that's where all our staff work. We now have 3 staff in Vancouver, 1 in Calgary, 1 in Winnipeg, 5 in Montreal, all over the Ontario now. Hopefully soon in the eastern part of the country. But really what it's done is it's expanded our hiring pool and made us truly national. And I think those are benefits that are hard to measure, but they're important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh. Go ahead, Amanda.
I think I was up. I was just going to tap into kind of the side that, things that are holistic and human-centered. We're big at Level, definitely around that human sustainability element of, meeting people where they're at for long-term sustainability, right? When it comes to well-being and driving that like in an organization. So when you're building a package, right? A benefits package. And we keep hearing this over and over that, that data and being able to collect that, but meaningful data is one-to-one data where you've asked people, and it is in a conversation like this where it is one-to-one. And yeah, it's a lot of work. It's hard work, but it's actually identifying like those needs, right? And I think there's one really good example, and I adore the work she does, is Claude Silver with VaynerMedia. She is kind of that embodiment of chief heart officer, and that's that heartbeat of organizations. And I think there's real value in that, things that are very holistic, very human-centered, very human approached. That's what people want. That's what they're looking for. And yeah, driving that.
Amazing. Olga, Omar, either of you want to jump in?
Sure, maybe I can say quickly, because Bruce, when you were speaking, I was thinking a lot of organizations since the pandemic have gone hybrid or almost fully remote. And actually from these organizations, we're seeing a lot of kind of new mental health challenges come up, as I was saying earlier. And I think one thing that's worked really well is when organizations really focus on reconnecting their people in the context of a remote work environment. So there's been organizations that have reached out to us on how to do this, and we've kind of been piloting a few things, but one thing that's actually worked surprisingly well are like retreats, where people literally get together for a few days somewhere in nature, and the only objective is for people to connect and get to know each other. Yeah. And I know always all the leaders all the time are trying to get as much work in there as possible, but I'm saying just do it, a couple of times a year, do it well, but just let people connect. So all that chat we used to have around the coffee machine or, going to lunch together, we don't have that anymore, right? In many contexts of organizations. So there has to be, I think, that ability to reconnect, to get to know your peers. And that really makes an impact on how people work together and on their mental health too, because we all want to have, good friendships at work. and strong connections.
I wouldn't mind building on one of the things Bruce said. OKRs, or objectives, key results, I think are really, really important for a hybrid environment or a flexible environment. Without OKRs or clear goal setting, it can be really easy to default to, oh, I need to see what this person is doing. But when we have objectives, key results, our team members can drive what success looks like, and that helps us better get to success. Now, our workplace, we're doing frontline social services. Not every position can be virtual, and so it's important just to think about what else can be done in that area. And so I come back to, how do we make the tools better? One of the things we've done is we've built systems for refugee sponsorship. So we have Embark, and it takes 1,000 hours of admin work out of refugee sponsorship. That's time that staff now spend one-to-one with people, right? No one goes into this work to do paperwork. They go in because they want to connect with people. And when we can make the work better aligned with what people want, we create a better workplace.
Phenomenal. You've all actually touched on something that we hadn't planned to talk about in this particular session, but I think is really important in terms of grounding this in practicality and grounding this in something tangible that folks can go and take away. And that's data and measurement and how we measure the impact of these benefits. I'm going to throw this question to all of you, and anyone feel free to jump in. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about how practically you've all been able to measure happiness and measure well-being. How do we even attempt to put metrics on something that is so personal in the context of a workplace? Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in here. I think part of it starts with intentionality. And so we do classic we call them employee pulse surveys. Twice a year, we check in with our people. And those the questions now are being guided by the practices that we have in place. And so we are looking for changes and comparisons. We're also looking to try and use other instruments that have maybe been around for a while to understand how things are working or not working. And give you an example around exit interviews. We noted isolation showing up in a couple of exit interviews. And I think to Olga's point, even just last week, we sat down and had a conversation with all of the staff who were hired since the start of the pandemic. So they did not have pre-existing relationships around the water cooler or in an office prior to the start of the pandemic. And the sole purpose of the conversation was to check in on connectedness and isolation, because we found something in an exit interview and went, boy, we better just touch base with them. And it was actually a great conversation on things that we can learn to improve some of our internal practices. So I think just understanding where the data sources are and using them in some cases almost like an early warning detection. So rather than waiting until things have become catastrophic, just as a little bit of a temperature check, maybe can head some things off.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that idea of exit interviews as a data source. I think we often think of data as a spreadsheet, columns and rows, but actually there's a lot of qualitative information out there that is probably just there to absorb. Omar, yeah. Olga, go ahead.
I was just going to chime in with around kind of that data element that we also do a like that daily check-in, but leveraging digital technology to do so, right? Where that sense of the well-being community is there, so it's like a central place for well-being. But that pulse of daily check-in. And I think the flip side is that, yes, you need the information for the organization, but you also need to be able to give it back to those members so that they have self-awareness around, where they're at, and give them that tool to, create self-awareness for themselves around the elements of well-being and, where are they, where do they want to go? But there's a deep dive here that can go into well-being and being able to get that sense check on organizations to, anonymized data that they can see, how their members are doing, what elements of their, pillars of the well-being that are, they see a downfall and, that they can support more than other elements that maybe are doing, well in. But yeah, visually see, it's just, how can you make decisions to, change the strategy without seeing the data? Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe to Amanda's point, like one thing we do when we go into an organization is we always do a diagnostic, and we ask employees to self-assess on different pillars of well-being. So we have mental, spiritual, occupational, environmental, social, and kind of a few others, right? And we track that over time. We start to see what happens when we start to implement programs, right? And what change there is. And a lot of, and you'll see scores like recently environmental has been really low, especially around younger segments of the workforce. It wasn't something we were kind of really expecting, right? But then you're constantly able to adjust and get that understanding to make people happy, right? Whatever that means and wherever that comes from. So that's really worked for us. But I think it's also important to track organizational outcomes so that we have continued investment and engagement in some of these types of programs. So what we do at that level is typically looking at churn, disability claims, absenteeism. There's kind of a few kind of different measures, but we ask organizations what they want to get out of these programs, what their key goals are. We get those metrics and we track and we track and we track. And we always say, if you're not tracking, don't invest in these programs, right? Because you want to know that something's actually happening and that you're working and you're putting your money in the right place. So there's different ways to do it at different levels.
Yeah. I would like to add to that as well. We made a point about performance reviews and exit interviews, and those are super important. One of the other shifts is moving from performance reviews as this quarterly or annual thing to continuous performance monitoring. That's a different way of doing things, and it gives you richer data. It's not necessarily more work. Sometimes it can feel like that up front, but instead of doing a performance review every quarter, you're trying to do that every 2 weeks. And one of the systems that's often talked about is 15-5, right? So you're spending 15 minutes every 5 days to check in with someone. And it gives you a way of seeing, hey, what's the pulse of the organization right now? How are people feeling, right? So those simple data points matter. And I think it's important to think about data in different ways. I think also calibration matters. We might be just looking internally at our organization, and that can feel really low and negative at times, especially when we're in the middle of some really huge societal changes that are still happening, right? If we look at what's happening within the social service space, we see a huge increase in demand for our services and resources haven't kept pace. And so we can look at what's happening internally in our organization and feel really dismayed. But it's important to say, hey, what's happening in other organizations in the sector? What's happening in government? What's even happening in tech? I remember reading a while back from the chief people officer at Microsoft, which is an organization that's not short of resources, talking about record apathy, talking about isolation in the workforce, talking about all these huge challenges they were dealing with. And it was interesting, not to give anyone a pass, but it's interesting to see some of the most resourced organizations are really struggling with these challenges as well. And so, I think it's important just to think about what can we be doing to compare ourselves to how are we doing month over month or week over week to make small improvements. I think helps us think a little bit better about these problems.
Yeah, maybe if I could just pick up a little bit on that, because one of the other things I do want to make sure is stated and well understood is that for us, this transition to the 4-day work week all hasn't been hearts and flowers. There's been some speed bumps along the way, but I think the importance of having a formal measurement system, and Omar, we're sort of like you. We don't do formal performance appraisals anymore. We do regular check-ins. Those have provided valuable insights to understand that it hasn't worked well for everybody. And therefore, do we have further work to do on customizing the 4-day work week model for ourselves in a way where we don't have some folks who are just feeling like they are over the moon with happiness and others who are just drowning in other ways? That's not the experience we're hoping to have for our staff. But I think the importance of having these ways of knowing, whether they're formal through surveys or they're informal through conversations, is critically important, because we discovered there was a group that was really struggling, and now we're sort of leaned into that a little bit more and say, will this work as it's currently constructed in the future? Might we need to think about customization within customization? We don't know yet. We're still playing.
Amazing. Just out of curiosity, have any of the rest of you had that experience as well of implementing something that you've thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic, and actually the opposite has happened? Maybe I'll let that one marinate for a little while while we move on to our next question. What's I think really interesting that's coming out as we're all talking is we are talking about tailoring, we are talking about customizing, and we are talking about making packages unique to people, to what matters to them. Olga, I really liked what you touched on at the very beginning about people calling on indigenous healers and using Chinese medicine as a means to explore what well-being means to them. And so one of the questions that I wanted to pose to you all was, particularly when we in the sector thankfully and gracefully have a more and more diverse workforce, how do we ensure that the benefits reflect the diversity of that workforce as well? Amanda, perhaps we'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think it really comes down to, and I will sound like a squeaky wheel, but that's okay. Listening and learning, right? And like listening to those needs, whether it's focus groups or surveys or one-to-one conversations, right? And being able to act upon, after that, but really listening to what those needs are, gathering the data, then making those decisions. And I think when it comes to, these, communities that, we significantly do need to support and recognize and acknowledge, what it is that they truly need. It's just knowing that the impact of that hard work is that it'll make a massive difference, whether it's providing a well-being benefit, right? Of, maybe it's experts and coaches that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have access to, right? And just that impact can be really, really massive, and on a one-to-one level, it can change someone's life by giving that, and even providing them with a community of people when it comes to do solutions offer that, or the organization offer a community to support their well-being, so that alone can drive make real impact when it comes to kind of what you do as an organization when it comes to well-being.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, maybe I'll hop in on this one. Boy, we could spend a lot of time on this topic. It's so interesting, and I think, first of all, a statement. Imagine Canada is a primarily white-led organization.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at our senior leadership, at 9 years, I am one of the most junior staff. So there has not been a lot of transition of roles at that time. So for us, this is this is about progress, not perfection. It is about intentionality to evolve and change. And it is about setting the practices and systems in place for that evolution and change. Maybe a personal comment. For me, education has been profound in my continued growth as a leader. I'm speaking personally here. Where we started 2 years ago, we started an anti-racism, anti-oppression book club. I'd never even been part of a book club anywhere, let alone take on topics like this. It has been amazing in terms of understanding the place that I hold as a CEO and the place that I hold as a privileged older white male in Canadian society. I hope then that education that we have collectively gone through have been setting the conditions for more difficult and honest conversations. Last year we were really fortunate to work with about 15 other organizations on something called the Equity Benchmarking Project. And it was a survey of charities and nonprofits. Over 1,600 participated, where we collectively held a mirror up and said, how are our organizations doing around inclusive practices? And I would say if there was a dominant theme that came out of this, it was around leadership matters, and it matters a lot in terms of whether organizations are going to work differently in the future than they do now. And so I think for us, it has been, how do we kind of take that information to heart? Everything from equity audits, which we've done, to having equity working groups, which we have at both a staff and board level. The levers of change that were showing up in the research, how are we ourselves ensuring that those are embedded in our practices?
Absolutely. Omar, Olga, either of you want to chime in there as well?
Maybe I'll say quickly. So I definitely agree with you, Bruce, that leadership matters. And I'm thinking kind of specifically of one wonderful leader that we worked with in the past. And they did have a diversity and equity and inclusion strategy, but they wanted to do something more and were looking for interesting ways. So they asked their people, what's kind of the biggest challenge? And one of the things that came up was really kind of not being able to, or having to take days off for their own kind of cultural holidays, right? Whether it's Ramadan or whether it's kind of any type of kind of cultural celebration that they want to go to. So they actually introduced a benefit where individuals can take up to a certain amount of days off every year to go and do what they need to culturally, connect with their communities, and not feel like this has to get in the way of their scheduled work or their sick days or whatever that may be. And that was hugely successful within the context of that organization. So I think we're seeing really some employers go above and beyond in not only listening, as Amanda was saying, but also then responding with kind of interesting new kind of innovative solutions around this topic.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate what Olga has to say. Things like inclusive holidays help people bring their whole self to work. There can be many, many small things where we don't realize that the dominant system is oppressive for people. And something like seeing your holidays or having schedule flex around Ramadan can help people see themselves reflected in their workplace.
Phenomenal. Okay, I want to move a little bit on to what this looks like practically and tangibly for leaders and decision makers in the sector. Obviously, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, very, very resource-strapped sector, right? It's highly likely that it's an ED or, in some cases, even a bookkeeper making these decisions. So I know, Bruce, we spoke about that a couple of days ago. So who, in this context, understanding that organizations of various sizes are listening today, but all with that common goal of, we want to make sure that we're putting good out into the world, but we need to fill our own cup before we put good out into the world, right? Who takes responsibility? But also I'm going to add a little twist onto that question because I know you were all expecting that one. The twist that I want to add is something that Omar mentioned earlier about collective care. And how do you want to see collective care exercised practically in the sector?
Okay. Interesting. I'm going to have to think about that one a little bit, but
yeah.
I maybe two comments on the first part of the question. So one is I've referenced the language of leadership a few times in my comments, and I just want to make sure that it's clear that our most significant workplace benefit changes, the leadership has emerged throughout the organization. So I would say the drivers of the 4-day work week adoption was a middle management level who came and gave voice to ideas of thinking differently. Similar, I would say that the key drivers and we use the language of anti-racism and anti-oppression at Imagine, of that work has come from all different levels of the organization. And I think that's been really, really valuable and really important. Maybe one example, because we're an organization of 35, so we don't have a manager of human resources or a director of human resources. Is in 2020, we made a structural change to the way some of our leadership functions work within the organization. And we created something called a leadership council. And it is comprised of people from all levels of the organization and different departments. And so CEO, VP, directors, managers, coordinators, assistants. We have folks from all of those levels on the Leadership Council. Its mandate is around well-being, culture, development, change management, and internal communications. Those are the key things that it focuses on. Essentially, it filled a gap that was being done in a light touch way by a handful of people in the organization. And now it is an intentional group that meets monthly, is driving work forward. And I would say it's that group that is collectively responsible for the major improvements that I would say that we've made at ours. And sometimes they've been stumbles and sometimes they've been good, but a lot of the changes that we've been seeking to make. In terms of the idea of collective care, so I just want to clarify, Charlene, are you talking about collective care as a sector or for the organizations that we're
Very good clarification question. The latter.
The latter. Okay.
Mm.
I one of the observations I've seen is individuals throughout our organization who I think, and hopefully I'm right on this, they would support me on this statement, that feel more confident giving voice to more difficult issues. And it could be around health and well-being issues. It could be around equity and inclusion issues. It could be about anything. My sense is that there's more openness collectively to hearing that, and there are more networks built within and amongst each other, that if someone is mulling it over or struggling, that they've got places to go to right away, let alone formal systems. They've got informal folks that they can talk to and just give voice to those issues that they might be struggling with.
Mm. Olga, I'm going to bring you in as someone who's worked with numerous different organizations. So would love to hear if that resonates with you and what you've seen in action.
Yeah, you know, and maybe because one thing I really want to also respond to is in terms of who takes responsibility, because I think like in Bruce's case, we're seeing often it has to start at the top, right? And not only does it have to start at the top, but you need leaders that are like seriously passionate about this topic and seriously wanting to listen and kind of make the changes. But then this is where it gets difficult, right? It starts at the top, then it's handed over to HR, and then HR is so busy and they've got so many kind of other things going on their plates, and programs are sometimes not often properly implemented, right? And nor is there this kind of collective care where really this is not a top down, but really a bottom up type of, well-being plan that has impact. So I would definitely kind of on the who takes responsibility, I would absolutely say get the right guidance around this. Don't give it to a person, but really give the organizational, create a team or a collective across different facets where you can hear different viewpoints, where you can implement these types of programs everywhere. And maybe that's kind of part of the collective care as well, right? This is really a program designed by your employees, for your employees, driven by a leader that is passionate and that really cares and that's willing to kind of invest in this. And one piece of, I guess, response that I get that really frustrates me sometimes is like, we don't want to do too much around well-being because we feel that our workers are going to keep asking for more, right? We don't want to extend this branch because it's just going to go out of control. And I've seen the exact opposite, just to say, for anyone who's worried about this, right? I feel like if you start to really get in there, if you start to listen, if you start to engage, I mean, not only will people expect less, but also a lot of these problems disappear, right? A lot of these HR issues, a lot of these challenges that kind of are manifesting become much more manageable, right? And again, it's linking back to working together as a community for the community in terms of how we design and implement these programs.
Mm-hmm. Omar, Amanda, either of you want to jump in? I
can jump in. Yeah. Definitely on that collective side, I definitely agree. I think, leaders are, a driving element. I think maybe even more so, and Olga kind of tapped into this, and I think Bruce too, but like finding your champions within the organization, whether, small, big, whatever, that is exactly what we call those people at level, our champions, and we give them that credit. They're walking around all organizations, who they are, the ones that are showing up with their, their nutritious lunch and their snacks, right? Those people are driving just by showing up as they are. They're driving well-being within your organization. So being able to tap into those, and I think it's probably easy enough to say that people who are in that space of taking care of themselves, they're usually happy to help others do that, right? That's part of what comes along with well-being. So, really like tapping into those so that you do have that collective effort coming from, all angles of your organization, but just knowing that, it could be anyone, not just obviously that HR leader that needs help, and yeah, we're hearing that left, right, and center, right? Like that's support. It's my well-being, your well-being, what Charlene needs, what Bruce needs. It's so vast, so different that, and we see it in like science in terms of like packs when it comes to well-being and survival odds. It makes sense that we do well-being together because survival odds are better when we are supporting each other and encouraging each other. So there's real leaning into the collective on it for sure.
Omar, you've got the last word.
Yeah, I want to just lean in on one of the things Bruce said about the Leadership Council. Oftentimes in small organizations for EDs, it can feel like you're carrying all the weight by yourself, but it's really important to share the load. And when you share the load, it's a lot lighter.
Yeah,
absolutely. Bruce, I know you've got something to add to that too.
Yeah, it's interesting. The conversation, I think, has really serviced a number of really valuable points. One for me, as I think about this for our sector writ large, I mean, we haven't talked about that at all. I mean, we are an employer of 2.4 million Canadians. We're 10% of the workforce. It's an extraordinarily large group. This imperative around workplace well-being feeds into being a competitive employer. And I think we do need to acknowledge that we're living in times of labor market shortages in some areas. We work in a sector that is highly human. Some or little of our workplace will be replaced by robotics or artificial intelligence. There are still going to be highly human pieces of work that are done. If we work under the assumption that the private sector is upping its game to ensure that they're attracting the best talent, how do we as a nonprofit sector respond? It's unlikely we can match them compensation for compensation dollar. We don't offer stock options, often not bonuses, certainly not company cars. We need to think about, at least this is my belief, we need to think about ourselves as an attractive best employer that is establishing a presence whereby people can both fulfill their mission and cause interests and earn a decent living, be looked after, know that their family work-life balance is going to be in place, because so many more people are looking at those things. In a study we did in 2019, right before the pandemic, of Canadian employees, 50% of employees were looking at the behavior of companies prior to applying for their next job. So they were looking at companies and their connections with community. They were looking for all different kinds of things. It wasn't about the almighty dollar. I think this is where thinking about this kind of topic of well-being, job flexibility, job growth, professional development can actually create a suite of pretty attractive offerings. And we need a steady stream of good talent to deliver quality services and programs. So I think this is more than a nice to have. This is a must to have.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add to what Bruce said. This is a place where people can do some of the best work of their career, and that's a huge benefit. Right? What are we doing to take the barriers and obstacles out of doing the best work you can? Right? The highest impact work you can, making having the best benefit to society, right? And sometimes there's internal things that we are doing to perpetuate systemic inequity. We have to look at that. Sometimes there's tools in place, and sometimes there's the compensation and bend, right? Traditional compensation and bend, that's part of that. But first and foremost, the thing that drives people to us is people want to do good work.
Yeah. And I'll just add, it doesn't have to be expensive or complicated or overwhelming or take you so far out of your day-to-day job to actually do this, right? We've implemented programs in organizations for a few $1,000s a year, right? And I think what's really important here is for the sector to learn from each other. There's things that you can implement today that won't cost you anything, apart from a bit of time from your teams, right? And a bit of creativity. And it's totally manageable and doable without having to invest in $100,000, multi-year well-being program. And we are seeing real results from some of these with just that passion and commitment to ongoing work.
Fantastic. Amazing. Bruce, Amanda, Olga, Omar, thank you so much all for your time today. I'm going to attempt to summarize what was actually a really, really fruitful conversation. We started talking a little bit more about data and, where do we meaningfully collect data on the impact of these workplace wellbeing programs, and where do we acknowledge that there are maybe data points that we aren't paying attention to as well. And then when we closed was, this is a collective responsibility. It doesn't just fall on the shoulders of the ED or an HR representative or a bookkeeper for that matter. It's a collective responsibility. And there's a responsibility to manage upwards to some extent as well when there are needs that aren't being met. I really like that idea of taking the barriers away from doing some of the best work of your careers. I think that's a really, really lovely note for us all to end on. Thank you all so much for taking the time today, and for folks who are joining and watching, we hope you've had a really wonderful time at the summit so far. There's still a lot of programming happening for the rest of the afternoon, but there is a break that will follow immediately after this session. You can tune back in at 1:30 p.m. Eastern for a musical performance, which will be super, super exciting. Thank you again, Bruce, Amanda, Olga, and Omar for your time today. And yeah, we'll see everyone very soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.